My name is Rosalyn Metz, and actually, let me move you guys so it looks like I'm looking at you. My name is Rosalyn Metz. I am on Fedora Leaders. I currently work at Emory University in Atlanta, and some of my team members are giving a presentation tomorrow about their experience with migrating Fedora to 6 in a Sambera context, so the work that they've been investigating. But right now I am here as an OCFL editor. So I am one of 4, 5, I don't know how many of those are, OCFL editors. I do not have a British accent, which makes me in the minority in the OCFL editors group. That's actually just coincidence. It's not Oxford tied or anything. I mean, it is, but for those of you that don't know, the Oxford Common File Layout actually resulted from meetings in Oxford, England. It was based Samvera Fedora camp that occurred in Oxford, England, and Andrew Hankinson, who is no longer an OCFL editor because he's gone on to do new things with his life, was asking lots of questions about the previous, from the previous text lead, Andrew Woods, and the two of them then wrote a white paper, and the OCFL editors, I don't really know how we formed. I know that Andrew came up to me at one point and asked me, would you be on the editorial board? And I think it was mostly from people who had real interest in OCFL or had similar experience with related specifications to digital preservation. So Aaron asked if we would give an update. And since I was going to come anyway, here I am giving an update on the OCFL community. So the OCFL was started, as I said, as an open community effort. And the specification itself is application independent. You do not need an application to create an OCFL object. I guess you need your computer or a computing device. Maybe not. I guess you could create an OCFL object on paper. Interesting, I thought. But it's application independent, and it's a way of storing versioned data for long-term access. So it does not necessarily describe the way a repository functions. It describes a way of storing files for your application. And we said long-term access because I became a convert of saying long-term access rather than preservation, because it's really what we're trying to do when we preserve things. We're trying to make them accessible for the long haul. So just like a really quick primer for some OCFL terms, I have here the OCFL object structure. OCFL objects live in what is called a storage root. A storage root is a collection of OCFL objects. OCFL objects, the structure itself, it actually is only 3 files. An OCFL object creates 3 files. It creates the namaste file, which hopefully you all can see my cursor, which is that OCFL object 1.1. That just declares the version of OCFL that you're using. It then creates the inventory.json file. And that inventory.json file is actually sort of the meat of OCFL. It describes all of the content and object, the stuff contained within an OCFL object. And then the last thing is the inventory.json in this case, a SHA-512 file. And that is a hash of the inventory.json file so that you know that the inventory.json file isn't corrupted. So these three files are kept at the root of an OCFL object structure. An OCFL object also creates directories, obviously the directory for the object itself, and then underneath it versions. So in this picture here, there's a version 1 of an object, and underneath each version there is the inventory.json and the SHA-512 hash, or again, stored. That's so if you want to recreate version 1 when you're like at version 10, you can. You still have the copy of the inventory.json at version 1. And then there's the file folder for content, and that's where all your stuff goes. So whatever you decide is an object is goes in that content directory. One of the things that I've noticed is that with the advent of OCFL, there is a lot more conversation going on about what an object is. OCFL does have a minimum understanding of an object, but it's very, very minimum, like baseline minimum. It's a group of one or more content files and administrative information. That's it. That's an OCFL object as far as the specification is concerned. And that grouping is then pulled together and identified by a single URI, so a single identifier. One of the things we as editors have been involved in more recently are lots of conversations about what constitutes an object, what makes up an object, what should we be including in an OCFL object structure. And I think those are really good conversations to have. I feel like we in the repository space had sort of gotten away from that, and have been talking a lot more about like presentation of objects instead of like the intellectual, like what constitutes an object. So a little bit about sort of the status of OCFL. In addition to releases of the specification, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, we've did an alpha release in October of 2018, a second alpha in February of 2019, a beta in July of 2019, and then we waited a really long time and actually did release 1.0 in July of 2020. So OCFL has technically only been around for 3 years, like 1.0 has only been around for 3 years because we're in 2023, right? Yeah. Just to show you what I know about space and time. And then we did a release 1.1 in October of 2022. And that release was to make some changes to things like typo, very minimal clarifications. We continue to make small changes like that, but we haven't cut a new release because they haven't really amassed yet to a new release. We also have, if you're curious, some other things that you can take a look at. There is the OCFL community extensions. So you can create extensions for the OCFL sort of base structure. A great example is actually two that I know Fedora uses. One is, I think they use the pear tree extension, but Dan, please correct me if I'm wrong. And then, or any of the developers. And then, and that's if you don't know what pear tree is, it's a way of nestling folder structures for an object group so that it's nestled by object identifier. And then there is also the mutable head, which allows you to turn off auto versioning in Fedora. So the community extensions are there. if you have an extension that you've created locally and you feel like lots of people would use it, or you know that lots of people are using it, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to include you in the community extensions repository. OCFL editors review those extensions just to make sure that they're make sense. And then we usually try to get community members to do the approval for the extensions. We also have here a list of OCFL implementations. Fedora is one of them. We have, let's see, Invenio is looking to implement, or they may have already, or they're in the middle of development, the OCFL specification. The University of Technology Sydney, they have implemented OCFL, and there's a number of other. Harvard is implementing OCFL, and there's a few others. So I put these slides in the share folder, and I can put the link in after I'm done presenting. The next is OCFL fixture objects. So those are objects. We have good objects, bad objects, and objects will just throw a warning. And so if you want to test out maybe Fedora repository by ingesting some objects, you could probably go there and do them. So those are there as a way of testing validators. And then we also have OCFL guidelines for projects. And we set this up just to make sure that folks aren't reinventing wheels. We want people to work together. So maybe not have 50 OCFL Javas, but just like one. Or 50 OCFL Goes, maybe just like one of them. So we created that guidelines for projects because that question was coming up. Other updates. We have been having listening sessions over the last few months, 2 months. We had one last month during our community meeting that is at a time convenient for those in Asia and Australia. And then tomorrow, which Erin thankfully put on the agenda for here, there will be an OCFL community meeting. And again, this is a listening session. We're trying to gather feedback on the specification to identify what can be improved or updated. We're starting to think about version 2. But remember, we are a digital preservation specification. And if you look at this timeline, it's going to be a while till version 2 comes out. But we want to start that process because it'll probably be a couple of years before we would get a version 2, if not longer, out the door. And then Neil Jeffries will be at iPres at UIUC, and we'll be doing a Birds of a Feather session there. So if you're at iPres, you can join a listening session there. We also have ways of reviewing and contributing use cases, links. You can submit issues if you see something wrong, typos, things like that, or like things that are very confusing in the specification. Happy to hear about those too. And then, of course, one of the reasons I wanted to come here is because I wanted to hear about people who maybe were implementing Fedora 6 and had some questions and thoughts on OCFL. So please feel free to reach out to me, or if you know one of the other OCFL editors, you can do that as well. And these are links to things that you might want to join. Does anybody else have questions? Here's my email address. You can always email me. Happy to get emails.
I will say, as obviously Fedora 6 Java implementation, we are one of those community projects that has met and kind of went through the guidelines, and we now meet as a group quarterly.
Mhm.
which was actually a really good reminder that I'm in charge of coordinating those meetings and I need to redo that schedule. So anybody that's interested in gathering together to discuss implementation of the Java implementation of the OCFL, i.e. what we use in Fedora, we meet as a community project group quarterly.
Yeah.
Starting
'Cause
when is a
Fedora is not
TBD.
Fedora is not the only institution that uses OCFL Java. So there are some people who
Exactly.
just use OCFL Java without Fedora. Um, so there's discussion about maintaining that, and that actually came about because Peter Winkles went off to do, who was the original creator. He went off to do great things in the universe, just like Andrew Hankinson left us.
Well, thank you for that, Rosalyn. Does anybody have any other questions? We have another minute or two before break. Happy to field any other questions.